right. Well, hello everyone. Welcome to the webinar today, and thank you so much for joining us. I'm excited for our panel discussion today with these fine individuals. A few housekeeping notes before we get started. This presentation is being recorded, and we'll share the recording as well as the slides as soon as possible with those who attended. We're also saving the last 10 to 15 minutes for questions. So if you have any questions, please feel free to type them in the Q&A panel, and we'll get to as many of them as possible at the end of the session. Great. So hi, I'm Anusha Sethuraman, Head of Product Marketing here at Fiddler Labs. We are an explainable AI startup based in the Bay Area. And our mission at Fiddler is to enable companies to explain, monitor, and analyze their AI systems so they can build trustworthy AI that also generates positive business impact. I'm really excited today to host this panel and this opportunity to chat with these Responsibly AI experts. So let's go ahead and meet our panel today. We have Sarah Bird from Microsoft, Natalia Burina from Facebook, and Abhishek Gupta from Hired. Thanks to all of you so much for joining us. We really appreciate the time here. So I'd like to start with a quick round of introductions. Sarah, would you like to go first?
Sure. Hi, everyone. So I work in our Azure AI organization, and I develop both open source tools for responsible AI as well as lead our efforts in terms of responsible development and use of our own products.
Wonderful. Thank you. Natalia, how about you?
Hi, everyone. Excited to be here. I'm a product lead at Facebook where I build products using artificial intelligence. I also worked on building AI products at Salesforce and Microsoft as well.
Wonderful. Thank you. Abhishek?
Hi, I'm Abhishek Gupta. I focus on engineering at Hired. Hired is a two-sided marketplace that helps connect people with a job that they love. And we leverage AI and machine learning quite extensively. And we also leverage sort of Fiddler explainable AI. I'm excited to share more.
Wonderful. Thank you. So as we get ready to kick this off, I wanted to provide a viewpoint on what responsible AI is. And this is how we think about it at Fiddler. So we have 4 key elements that we believe any responsible AI implementation should consider: transparency, accountability, ethics, and reliability. So just diving one step further into that, what does this really mean? So transparency behind AI is needed to ensure that stakeholders have visibility and insights into what their AI systems are doing. They're able to understand the why behind the decisions and predictions that their AI systems make. And they also pay attention to privacy and security. Accountability is a way to make sure that as AI systems are being built, there are checks and balances in place. They follow guidelines from a governance framework of sorts, and most importantly, that there's human oversight into AI so that there's an opportunity to override decisions when it's critical and needed. Ethics is broadly that AI is doing well by everyone who's impacted by it. So it's fair and inclusive to everyone involved. And reliability, I think, is one of the most important things because it means that you're ensuring all of these elements and these aspects are maintained as your AI systems continue to operate in production. So your models are not decaying over time. Your data is still good, it's integral, and it's representative of everyone who you're serving in the audience. So I know that many organizations tend to have their own definition of responsible AI. So let's jump to our panelists and check in with them. So Sarah, why don't we start with what you think about responsible AI and why it's critical?
Yeah, so as you said, many organizations have their own principles. At Microsoft, we use we have 4 principles sort of at the top level, which are privacy and security, fairness and inclusiveness, and also, sorry, and also reliability and safety. And then underneath that, we have transparency, and underneath that, we have accountability. Mm-hmm. And so in general, those are the ones that we're striving for when we're building AI. But depending on what business you're in or what industry, it might be that different principles apply to you. And so I think that responsible AI is really more about making sure that you have principles and you're thinking about the impact of the technology that you're creating, and you're designing it and testing it and building it in such a way that you are sure that you're upholding those principles and that you're having the impact and the effect that you want the technology to have, and trying to minimize the unintended impact. And I think this is just absolutely, critical in general. We don't want our technology to be having unintended consequences or significant negative impacts on individuals. And so because AI in particular is a complex technology that may have sort of failure modes or effects that we don't often sort of naturally expect, it's extra important in this case that we really are disciplined about our responsible AI practices, and that we have that accountability, and we're sure that our systems are upholding our principles.
Absolutely, makes a lot of sense. Natalia, would you like to go next?
Yeah, sure. So I think this is a great conversation for us to be having, because there's been such a proliferation of AI applications in recent years. It's really been a boom. And so it is incredibly important for us to think about how to build AI responsibly. Now, the thing to understand is, because a lot of this field is so new, thinking about it in a way that's responsible is also a very evolving area. So when I think about responsible AI, I like to borrow from medicine. And in medicine, there's the Hippocratic Oath, which says, first, do no harm. Right. So it's very important for us to consider the potential harms, potential risks when we build AI. Now, what does that mean? I think, Anusha, you did a great job of encapsulating some of the key areas, but you have to think about ensuring fairness. We have to consider how we preserve our users' privacy, and how do we give users transparency and control. So, famously in psychology, when people feel that they have control, they feel happy. And with AI, this is especially important because a lot of it is such a black box. Right. So we have to really be mindful of what the technology is potentially doing to users and customers. The other thing I want to hit on quickly is, why is this critical? Well, it's critical because, first of all, famously, software is eating the world. So technology in general is making inroads in areas where it never has before. Now, AI specifically, why is AI such a big thing? It's due to three things. One, we have more data than we've ever had before. Two, we have a huge increase in compute power. And three, relatively minor but important technical advances in deep learning, et cetera. These things have been around for a long time, but finally we have some breakthroughs, and that's why AI is really taken off, and why this is critical, and now is really the time for us to focus on it and be more crisp and clear about how do we build AI responsibly.
Yeah. Absolutely, makes a lot of sense. So Abhishek, I know you come from a smaller organization, and love to hear your perspective on how you view responsible AI and why it's critical.
Cool. Yeah, in this conversation, I'll focus on AI as seen and felt by the consumers or enterprise, that is AI applications. Mm-hmm. And so for me, valuable AI applications either help us get back more time or provide some new insight. And an important framing here also is that AI is not a product in of itself. It is a technology that gets woven into key jobs that need to be done. So with this in mind, inevitably on the other side of AI is a human being. And so responsible AI systems are those that either systematically discover and reduce known biases that we are aware of, and increasingly are also able to avoid creating new unintended negative consequences. Sometimes outcome of AI systems can be non-intuitive and hurtful, and we'd have to not just have an optimistic perspective in mind as we design AI system, but we'd also have to do scenario planning around a variety of different negative consequences while designing the system to begin with.
Absolutely, makes a lot of sense. So just jumping on top of that here, Hired has a use case that makes a lot of sense for responsible AI. And I'm curious, what are some of those other use cases that you think where responsible AI is really important and critical as well.
So, at Hired, our mission is to help everyone find a job that they love. And in order to connect talent with opportunity at scale, we leverage AI because it has scale benefits. It helps us do stuff in a more cost-efficient way.
Mm-hmm.
So specifically, we apply deep learning-based models to transform a hired candidate profile into a score, and for matching, and we have geography and role-specific models. So in terms of responsible AI, we do like the following things already. One is in our deep learning models by design, we make sure that no gender and ethnicity features are used so that there's no conscious bias. We also balance training data to ensure that systems cannot inadvertently learn that certain features are more correlated with certain genders. Granted, none of these techniques are perfect, but we are proactively putting in the effort to ensure that we're not biasing the models. And this is a key area of focus for us.
Mm-hmm.
Secondly, we've sort of thought through how explicitly in the in-product customer-facing sort of setup, we have nudges to ensure that customers don't inadvertently send interview requests to candidate for a salary lower than what they've been sending for a given role, just because a candidate is asking for less, so that it helps close the wage gap that we see. We all know that statistically, individuals in underrepresented groups end up asking less versus everyone else in aggregate for the same level of experience. Thirdly, this is more recent for us because on the other side of AI as a human being, and sometimes the outcomes of AI systems are now unintuitive and can be hurtful. We have some sort of ways of explaining within partnership with Fiddler, and this is helping gain trust. We've made the explainable Fiddler sort of setup available not just to the ML team, but also to our cross-functional stakeholders. And this is allowing them to gain more empathy and understanding of how AI system works. It's demystifying it. It's also helping us get actionable feedback from their perspective. And we are getting some of the multidisciplinary benefits that is sort of needed to create systems at scale that work well. And fourthly, we also monitor not just aggregate results, but monitor results across some sort of key dimensions around gender and ethnicity to ensure that not just in aggregate results are good, but also for certain dimensions that we care about, we are able to see the impact. Wanted to reinforce, however, though, that this is a relatively new and advanced area. We don't have a full understanding just yet.
Mm-hmm.
And we are actively working on improving the outcomes in a responsible way.
Wonderful. Well, thanks for sharing that. I know you mentioned a lot of points there, and interestingly about having these different stakeholders involved, etc. So I'd love to ask maybe Sarah or Natalia around just organizational approach and those stakeholders. In your experience, how has that looked?
I can talk about how we've done it at Microsoft.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things that I think the whole industry is realizing is that there isn't sort of one person that is responsible for enacting responsible AI. Many different roles across the company have a part to play in that. And similarly, we've had to create organizations that kind of line up with those different roles and those different parts that people need to play. And so the first organization that we created at Microsoft, it was called Ether. And this is our cross-company group of experts who really understand, where sort of the cutting edges and help create new technologies and new practices and new recommendations for the company in terms of enacting responsible AI. And so, for example, if in my organization we have a very sort of hard, unsolved problem, we would go to the right group inside of Ether and ask them to, bring together experts to help with that particular problem. However, in addition to that, we also, need to set the sort of the standards or the policy for the company so that everyone understands, where is the bar and what does it mean to do responsible AI, and how do you know when you have done what's expected of you. And so we have another organization that sets that standard and policy for the company and educates people on how to actually implement the standard, builds organizations so that people are, every team has someone who's an expert in this and can actually help them implement it. And then a standard or a policy that goes across a company is still, doesn't answer a lot of questions For example, if I'm working on an application where privacy is particularly important, I might need to go a step beyond the standard, or it might be non-obvious on how to apply that. And I might want to explore new technologies. For example, I work on differential privacy, so that's one that's top of mind for me. What we have then is embedded expert teams who can actually help the organization go and take that gap from policy to practice and help us actually enact that. And so we're finding that any new problem or any place where we have to add responsible AI, we usually need to bring together experts from research and from this thought leadership group, legal and policy experts, as well as our sort of experts in practice who have the design and ethics and data science expertise. And so it really is, it's a great area to work in for this reason. There really is this amazing sort of multidisciplinary collaboration. But that's also one of the reasons it's so hard for any organization to adopt it and roll it out, is because a lot of these, we've done a great job of defining what these different roles are and how they work together. And now all of them have to work together in a new way to collaborate on a responsible AI problem to solve it. And so it's really been quite a journey to sort of create these new structures and these new sort of groups of people, and enabling us to sort of solve these hard responsible AI problems.
Great. Well, thanks for sharing that. Anyone want to add anything? If not, I wanted to kind of, as the title of the webinar indicated, I did want to spend a couple of minutes talking about, so there's all of these practical things that you all have been talking about in terms of implementing this. So what is the reality on the ground versus what's hype surrounding responsible AI? Any thoughts to share here?
So one thought I want to share is that a lot of the AI hype is actually around AGI, which is Artificial General Intelligence. Not familiar with the acronym. But the reality is we're really nowhere near AGI. And what is more crucial when we build AI is to spend a lot more time thinking about how to build it responsibly and what that means. I think, we'll get into this a bit further in the next minutes, but it turns out that it's not trivial, and there's a lot to think about. There are a lot of considerations to take into place when building, and so we really have to take a step back and focus on responsibility versus some of the hype and the craziness around AI taking over the world. We're nowhere near that at this point.
Anybody else, Sarah or Abhishek?
Yeah, I think adding on to that, one of the biggest sort of misconceptions that we see when trying to do this in practice is that responsible AI can be solved, that there's something you do and then you're just done, right? Okay, we've implemented responsible AI and now we move on. And it's so much more like security, where there's always going to be new things, there's always going to be more you need to do. And so we need to recognize that this is a new practice, this is a new approach that we're adding, and we're never going to be done doing this. This is just another dimension that we're going to have to think of every time we're developing a technology. We're not suddenly going to not have to think about the impact of it anymore. Right. And so I think that's the biggest thing, is separating the conversation of, okay, what's the minimum bar where we feel like we're comfortable with the risk and we can ship and we want to move forward, versus, which is what we do in security too, versus the idea that, okay, you just do one time, you do responsible AI and now you're set, now you're done.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Cool. So, plus one to Natalia and Sarah's point, from my point of view, as with any key trend, it gets overhyped and oversold. There's some good reason for that as well, and some bad reasons. So at this point, for specific tasks, the AI algorithm, that infrastructure is now sufficiently advanced that with enough data, engineering time, and compute resources, one can build task-specific advanced AI systems that are practically very useful. Our ability to build these systems is also improving as folks can work at higher and higher abstractions. The ones that I'm familiar with, TensorFlow keeps getting better, SageMaker, the AI deployment infrastructure keeps getting better, and our ability to get representative training data is also improving. Now, the challenge is, as these improvements keep happening, so, many folks tend to incorrectly extrapolate this progress to a world where the rate of progress will suddenly get to a point where we get to an AGI, aka artificial general intelligence, where computers can outdo human in every possible way. And with the abstractions that we have today, it is hard to see that world 5 to 10 years from now. A much more actionable thing for us to maybe think about, in my opinion, is how is AI transforming companies and creating value? How should we learn about it and help augment our capabilities to accomplish more than what we can do today? And at the same time, we have to be cognizant of the possibility that there is some level of automation that's happening. And so what does that mean? My opinion is heavily influenced by this popular historian, Yuval Noah Harari, and someone who's written extensively about societal and individual impact of technology progress in the 21st century. So I'll give two key takeaways that have started sort of guiding how I think about this as well. So one is, no one exactly knows how the world will be in 20 to 30 years from now. And what is more clear is that it will be different, and we might need to reinvent ourselves, especially around retraining ourselves for the evolving job market. And the greatest problem is likely going to be psychological as we prepare ourselves for retraining, as we sort of age and grow. And so we have to, every 5 to 20 years, think about retraining what we knew and unlearning, which is quite hard. Second is, as tools become more advanced and AI driven, engineers will need to equip themselves with a broader multidisciplinary perspective so that they can more deeply understand the consequences of AI systems and encode the outcomes that reduce bias and minimize unintended negative effects. Teams will have to think about not just the optimistic positive impact, but also do scenario planning around a variety of negative implications of what they're doing. Suddenly, philosophical questions that people opine on will become real engineering concerns, because there will be practical implications of them from a systems design perspective. Self-driving cars are a great example. As people think about them, there was a point in time when there was no way that future could have even existed. Now, engineers are designing algorithms that can have real life impact on people's sort of life and death even.
Yeah. Great. Well, thanks for sharing that. I think let's jump in now. Let me do that. So I wanted to talk about the AI lifecycle that kind of as it exists today, and spend a few minutes discussing how responsible AI fits in to each of these stages. So briefly looking at this life cycle, you start with data and training, so determining data sets and what to use in training, moving on to designing and developing your models, you're approving and deploying them, and then you go on to continuously monitor and optimize them when in production. So Sarah, as we were kind of chatting before, you had some really great insights about the life cycle itself. So it'd be great if you can share that here now.
Yeah, I think I come from the machine learning community, and so this very much life cycle resonates with me. And this is, when we started Responsibly AI conversations, the kind of life cycle that, I would imagine looking at. And as we sort of have worked together in Microsoft to solve some of the harder problems, what we realized is this life cycle doesn't really capture, in fact, a lot of what you need to do differently for responsible AI. And so what really surprised me is that we really needed to focus a lot of our energy on what happens even before the data and training. The question of, for example, should I use AI in this application? Is it reasonable to do this automation? Do I need to design the system in a particular way to be robust if there is an AI model involved, right? And to be clear when it's failing. And so a lot of our focus has actually now been training people to spend a lot more time in the initial stage, which we call envisioning, where you're very much thinking about the product and what you're trying to achieve and the potential impacts. And so a lot of changing that kind of behavior up front is probably one of the most significant things that then helps you get in the right mindset to do all of the additional things you need to do at every other stage. And so that's probably been the biggest surprise to me, is that it really is this thing where you have to think about the application in the human system as well as just the particular, AI life cycle and the model you're building.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, and I was to say, but that said, there still is lots of things that we have to do at every stage. So I'm happy to talk about that as well.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. And before we jump into talking about every stage, I know, Natalia, you also had some really interesting thoughts around just this different sources of bias and how they're so varied. Would you share that with us?
Yeah, but I do want to echo a lot of what Sarah has just said.
Yeah.
We really have to think about building AI holistically, not just, the common rhetoric has always been that there's bias and unfairness due to biased data.
Yeah.
But there is so much more to that, and it starts from design up, to Sarah's prior points. Then, if we do look at this, which is incredibly useful for considering the whole life cycle, data is just a product of many factors. And there's a lot of historical context which is generated, and there's particular forms of measurement error that it can contain. Mm-hmm. So what's really important is to have a diversity of people who are collecting and training the data. Secondly, the big point I want to make, it's not just the data that causes problems. Issues can arise anywhere in the ML pipeline. And it really depends on what kind of choices and practices we have when we build, from evaluation methodology to model definition and anything else, all of which can have unwanted effects. Mm-hmm. So if you think about, for example, societal bias, it can really creep in the data piece here, in how the data is collected, formatted. There could be instances where you don't have enough data to properly represent certain groups. Yeah. There are instances where data, in the way that it's collected and formatted and labeled, it can manifest in bias. Then when you think about the features and how they're designed, that bias can creep in at that point. The way we have the architecture of the model, the objective function, the way we deploy, and also how we monitor and optimize these systems, all of these open the door, which is, again, why it's so important to be holistic and to think about these things, and to really have a plan about how we make sure that the systems are actually fair, they're robust, and they're done well. So again, this is something that's new, and as an industry, we're learning a lot, but it's a lot to unpack. And I think it's also very important to have open science and collaborate across academia and industry. At Facebook, we really have, we've really gone out and tried to have some research awards around this and author papers with other scientists in different labs to really push this forward. Yeah.
Got it. Well, thank you. Abhishek, just given how you do it at Hired, which is a much smaller organization, I was wondering if you can just take us through this life cycle of how it works.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, first of all, pass on to Sarah's and Talia's point. And so incremental to what they said, obviously, collaboration and systems thinking approach is critical for a sufficiently complex technology like AI. So maybe three key sort of actionable things incremental to what they've said that's sort of worth addressing is, from a tooling perspective, now there is a lot of advanced tooling around sort of improving and thinking about AI systems from a fairness and ethics perspective. Earlier techniques like, there are like data-based and model-based approaches. Data-based approaches would be training data collection, reweighting data points, rebalancing. Prior to like maybe two, three years ago, one would have had to do a lot of custom work to really sort of be on the cutting edge of how to do this well. Now, libraries like TensorFlows have many of these functionalities inbuilt. other model-based approaches like adversarial training, demographic agnostic remediation, constraint-based optimization, where you can encode for subsets of interest at hard constraint that the false positive rate can't be more than a certain percentage. These things were very hard to do earlier, but with modern tools, specifically TensorFlow has done an exceptional job at sort of adding these like packages that can be used. Obviously, motivation needs to be there, but the fact that tooling exists helps. Second is, companies like Fiddler, they've done these like nice visualization and fiddleable systems where, AI can be more accessible to folks beyond the individual ML teams that are building it. And that is also really helping us gain insight and feedback from curation team, from marketing, from sales, from a wide variety of different skilled individuals in terms of how we should think about adjusting on the outcome basis. And third is something that I recently discovered. TensorFlow launched this thing called Fairness Indicators Library, which further, advances the state of the art around the tooling that can do sort of evaluation across subgroups, model comparisons, counterfactual understanding. So for ML teams specifically, the broader point that I want to make is the tooling is improving a lot. And for folks who are initiated and who sort of care about this, it is getting easier and easier to bake responsible AI into their systems. And also companies like Fiddler is making and democratizing access to AI systems for non-AI experts as well. So I'm really optimistic in terms of how much progress we can make over time. And that is certainly our approach at Hired as well.
I want to jump in and add to that a little bit. So one of the tools that I work on is FairLearn, which is another open source tool to help you analyze the fairness of your model for different subgroups. And I completely agree with a couple of the points that Abhishek was saying, where one of the first things we learned is fairness in particular is a decision that's not just one made by the data scientist alone. And so we had to spend a lot of time designing the visualizations and the tools in a way that enable you to take it to the data scientists might be running the analysis, but they can take it to the other stakeholders and say, here are the results, what do you think? Do we want to move forward with this model? And having that ability also to export the results and be able to take it to your legal team or take it to the others was a huge part of the story. And the other piece is exactly this integration in the life cycle, in the platform. So we have taken both FairLearn, which is the fairness tool, as well as InterpretML, which is our explanation tools, and integrated them in Azure Machine Learning, and which is our end-to-end machine learning lifecycle tool. And so much of the use now has been because, before you decide to put that model in the production, now it's easy to just do that fairness test, or okay, you're building an auto ML model. Now you can just generate explanations right alongside that and decide if you're going to trust this model and if it's really answering the question you want it to before you put it in production. And we need to take these things even further so that it's monitoring the model once it's out there and it's not changing. But I think this has been a huge step forward in terms of the number of customers we see that are able to easily sort of adopt the state-of-the-art techniques or algorithms. And so really, these tools are, I think, probably the most significant step forward we've seen as far as having tools out there that you can use and having them be part of like machine learning life cycles and the machine learning tools you already use. So there's so many more people aware of responsible AI now as a result of the tools.
Yeah. So in one of the prep sessions, I know, Natalia, you were talking about how in the life cycle itself, this monitoring and optimizing, like Sarah just said, this continuous maintenance of high quality and, fair and unbiased models is kind of hard. So, and not everybody thinks about it all the time. So I wonder if you wanted to add any thoughts there.
Well, I think that the one thing is that even though we have great tooling and as an industry, we are making a lot of headway in this, again, the importance of thinking about everything holistically, and also the importance of having a team that's diverse and making sure that people are represented, because regardless of which stage, really the people who build do have an impact on how everything tends to pan out. And famously as an industry, we've made a lot of mistakes. And so not so much a tooling point, but just a
Yeah.
point overall that we have to figure out how to bring more diversity of people and points of view into the system. Because technical solutions are wonderful. I think it's great that we're making headway there, but we have to really start thinking about how do we include other voices as well, to make sure it is actually done responsibly, and that they are fairly represented in products and technologies.
Got it. Thank you. So just a quick note to our audience. I know that our panelists mentioned a bunch of tools, so we'll collect them and just share them out along with the recording and the slides. So just FYI on that. I had two follow-up questions here. One is, can you start implementing responsibly at any stage in this life cycle, or do you kind of have to start right at the beginning or even before the data stages like Sarah was talking about?
So, ideally it is good to take a systems thinking approach and start from first principles, problem formulation, training data set, objective function monitoring. But if folks are looking for a single place to start, I'd say what gets measured gets improved. So folks are measuring not just aggregate results, but also metrics for key subgroups, especially underrepresented groups. This would shed light on the impact that AI systems might be having that may not be as apparent when one only looks at the aggregate results.
Yeah, I think this is a really great question. And this was something we struggled with, where we made a life cycle that looks like this. And then everyone's like, okay, but are things already shipped? So like, we don't start at the beginning. Yeah. Does it not apply? What do we do? Yeah. And so I think the answer is which stage you want to focus your energy on is really going to be dependent on sort of where your challenges are. So a lot of people do find something because they start testing when they ship the model, but then they have to go back to other stages to discover that the issue was originally in the data, or it was in some design decision that was made. However, one thing that we're finding is, regardless, it's very hard to know where you want to focus your energy and where you want to look. If you don't have a good idea of the potential harms that you're trying to test for and the outcomes you're trying to avoid. And so we are finding that even for things that are already shipped, that it's quite helpful to go back and do what we call an impact assessment or an envisioning exercise or harms modeling. But we are having a lot of teams kind of go back and do that initial start at the beginning, thinking around what is the purpose of this, what are the potential effects of it, and then that helps you then jump into the right places in the life cycle and test and measure and look for the things that you want to look for. And so that's been interesting, just because it does feel a little funny. It feels a little bit like you're starting over. It's already shipped. What do you mean we're envisioning what the purpose of it is? But that really has helped make sure that you're focusing on the key parts in terms of really being sure that your system has the right impact for people.
Yeah, you could almost think about it as this, you're trying to optimize your model, and this circle it's circular for a reason, because you're kind of going back all the time. And now you're going back with these specific like responsible elements and thinking in mind, and you're optimizing for that. Makes sense. I had one more follow-up question here is, how does this differ based on whether you're part of a small organization or a large organization? Any thoughts?
I think in some ways it doesn't, right? We're still using the same tools. We're building the same great open source tools. We're building models the same way. Although one of the things that has been an interesting sort of journey for us is that the way that we go and solve any problem, right? You go and you discover that there's a difference between men and women in your model, and now you want to know what to do about it, and you want to find out why. Most of the time that still has involved bringing in the expertise and bringing in people who can sort of make decisions or change the algorithms. And all of that is a pretty sort of bespoke process, and also involves quite a lot of expertise. And so one of the things that has been interesting is to think about, how do we scale this up so that you could have all of the individuals in a large organization doing this without losing that depth and that you know, careful consideration, right? Because there aren't sort of quick and easy answers to a lot of these problems. And so I think that that's at least one of the things that sort of challenging as a large organization, is to figure out how you do this at scale.
Got it. Anybody else? Abhishek, since you're part of a small organization, how is it different or the same?
I mean, you know, like sort of we've taken more of a tools-based approach where, you know, the intentionality, the motivation is always there, from the CEO right to the, you know, exec team and so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
But, you know, the tooling and how to help continues to be a challenge. And so one of the things that we've tried to do is, first of all, want to just acknowledge it's technically complex field, surface area of AI is increasing, and, you know, the responsible AI field is evolving at a fast pace. That being said, for us, what has helped a lot is enabling access to these AI systems beyond the specific ML engineering team. Because one, it has demystified AI to a lot of extent. Two, it has helped build trust in what we're doing. Three, it has also allowed them to provide feedback. And it has also changed and influenced perspective of the ML engineering team. Since we're a small organization, we work very closely together. You know, marketing folks are talking to the sales folks, are talking to the engineering folks. And so it's very collaborative. And before, you know, and Fiddler, you know, your company has created an excellent product for this. Before this, it was very hard. The knowledge gap was so large and the understanding gap was so different that it was hard to like effectively collaborate on making AI systems better. And that has certainly been kind of the biggest sort of improvement over the last year and a half, in addition to the toolings that I've already talked about. And you know, that has also positively impacted the intentionality and how we internally discuss, debate, and show results.
Got it. I think that's a good segue into what we want to talk about next, which is this cultural impact. And you mentioned a lot of these points. So I'm curious, as you think about, you know, all the experiences that you've worked with companies or inside your companies, what are some of these cultural challenges that people will generally encounter when they start talking about responsible AI, and how do they react to it?
I can take that real quick. So one of the big cultural things is that, again, to the earlier point, a lot of this is new. So just thinking about it and having a plan in place and having a process is industry-wide. It's something that we haven't been thinking about as much as we should. So, you know, there's a saying, planning is indispensable, plans are useless. So I would just encourage everyone to push for a culture where there is a plan around responsible AI, because unless we have one, there's not much that's going to change.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's the starting point. You're laying the foundation for it with a plan. Anybody else? Any thoughts here or anything you want to add?
You know, on my end, I just want to reinforce the idea that, you know, even though the motivation of everyone to help is there, it is very hard for people to positively contribute on sort of improving the AI systems. And the multidisciplinary approach where one can engage more than the set of individuals who are building the system in not just seeing the outcome, but also providing explicit feedback, that goes a long way. So much so that, like, as a minor example, you know, by virtue of the sort of increased focus on responsible AI and having this explicit feedback loop, one of the individuals completely on his own did this inequality analysis to highlight how certain individuals, even though the curation systems and the deep learning systems are working per our expectations, but still how certain groups are disproportionately getting more interview requests relative to other groups of sort of similar quote unquote score. And that is now an active work stream for us. And that work stream happened by virtue of folks engaging cross-functionally and across different boundaries. And by sort of kicking off that conversation, so somebody sparked that idea, and then you know, one of the engineers went ahead and sort of dug deeper to realize that there is some opportunity there which we were missing earlier.
That's a great example.
Yeah, and I think one of the so I think culture matters a lot, and how easy or hard this is for any particular individual matters a lot about in terms of where their organization is with regards to this. So, for example, it takes time to go and do that bias analysis. It takes time to go and explore different models and look at the trade-offs. And so that's a really easy thing to do if you have the permission and the understanding from your leadership. It's much harder to get the time or the bandwidth to do that if your leadership doesn't understand anything about it. And so what we see a lot is, for example, with customers that are in industries that are regulated and are already sort of deeply aware of the impact that their decisions have on individuals. So you can think like healthcare or finance or governments. Then throughout the organization, you have an awareness of the potential issues, why this is important, why doing things like this produces better products and better outcome for people. And so it's much easier for them to adopt the newest practice, or for your data scientists to say, hey, there's a new research idea and we need to look into it. Where the organizations that traditionally haven't had to grapple with these issues as much because of their particular business, then you might not have that awareness in the leadership. And so it's much harder for the data scientists who are on the ground to kind of raise that.
Yeah.
Now, we've seen that's great is doing these things just does result in better products, more innovation. It's generally good. So once you have awareness in the leadership, it's easy to start sort of transforming the organization. But we do really have to go and build that awareness all the way through kind of to the top of the organization.
Yeah, that's the hardest part, I guess, sometimes. Great. So I know we're coming up on time, and I do want to leave some time for questions too. So let's quickly just maybe, what do you think the future holds in terms of, I'm curious what your thoughts are on AI governance specifically, that's starting to gain some steam. So any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think this is actually, I think, one of the conversations that the tools really starts with is, okay, there's a difference between men and women, as the example I gave earlier, and the outcome of the model. Now, who decides what to do about that, right? And it turns out often maybe it shouldn't be the data scientists, maybe they don't even want to be the one deciding. And so a lot of what we have now is tools and techniques and practices that are helping facilitate that conversation on governance and who makes the decision. And very much the next phase, I think we've seen many different organizations start creating governance entities. One of the things that Microsoft has in their AI business school is exactly advising teams to first make like a governance organization to think about this. So I think there's both sort of the responsibility inside of each company or each organization to think about how you're going to govern your AI systems, who's going to make different types of decisions, who do you escalate to. It's a key part of the story. And then also a lot of these, the decisions made and the effects of AI systems affect not just companies and not just their users or their customers, but also other stakeholders in society. And so I know, for example, several organizations came together and started the Partnership on AI to have a forum to talk about how, as a society, do we have conversations about who governs these, where, what parts should be regulated, how do we make decisions outside of organizations. And I think there's more questions there than answers at this point, but I think it's a huge and important conversation.
Absolutely.
Just one sort of more thing to highlight beyond what Sarah said. To the extent that organizations have the sort of bandwidth and resources to do this themselves, Microsoft certainly has that.
Yeah.
Obviously, that's probably the right approach. To the extent that organizations don't, similar to how functional excellence and expertise in certain areas are sort of now done on the cloud. AWS is a great example. Elasticsearch is a great example. Some of the AI governance, and I know Fiddler provides some of the tools that there. to the extent that organizations can't do it themselves, having some third parties for sort of checks and balances can go a long way.
Mm-hmm.
And so I certainly see many emerging startups, and Fiddler would be a great example of that, to start sort of filling this niche, given that this is a new and emerging area.
Got it. Well, thank you for that. So as we close out today's session, wanted to leave the audience with one takeaway from each of you. So Natalia, do you want to go first? Oh, you're on mute.
Apologies.
Okay.
Yeah, if I, for me, if there's one thing I want the audience to remember is that before we build AI systems and products, we really have to take a step back and consider potential risks and harms. And again, really take a step back and think about everything more holistically. And it's critical to evaluate all stages of the machine learning pipeline because, again, bias can creep in so many different places, not just the data.
Thank you. Abhishek, do you want to go next?
Yeah, I'll just say that, what gets measured gets improved, and it's most commonly done where you measure the aggregate results, and in aggregate things may look fine, but if one goes deeper into the specific subsets of underrepresented groups or any other subsets that the company may want to think more about, things can look different. And two, with the increased sort of tooling and support infrastructure, it gets easier and easier for us to follow a multidisciplinary approach beyond any specific function. With the combination of both of these, I feel pretty hopeful and optimistic that we can make a lot more progress than what we've made so far.
Great. Sarah?
Yeah, I agree with everything that was just said, and also want to add that I think one of the reasons that, in fact, some people find it so hard to get started in this or to grapple with what does it really mean to do is because it is so multifaceted. You have to think about the culture of your organization, the people that are on the team, the people that are involved in the conversation or the decision. You have to create new processes and new practices, as well as new tools and new innovation. And so it's great that we see a lot of great emerging practices across all of these fronts, and we're definitely going to need them all. And so as any organization or any person starts adopting this, make sure that you don't overly focus on just one part of the story. Like that might be your entryway, but you can only go so far without kind of thinking about all of the different dimensions.
Awesome. Well, thank you all so much. Let me do a quick check on questions here. Okay, so here's one. How do you balance an assessment of potential model bias between review of the model inputs and the model output? Anybody want to take that? So I'll read it again. How do you balance an assessment of potential model bias between review of the model inputs and the model output?
I think it's a good question. And in practice, at least, a lot of the tools we've seen in FairLearn, which I mentioned, and the TensorFlow tool that Abhishek mentioned, they focus on the model output, right? Because that's what you're shipping. That's the decision you want to check. But then as soon as you find a potential issue there, a difference or a disparity, you usually have to go look at the inputs of the model, but you also have to look at the model itself, right? It might be that the difference is appearing because of the features for the model or because of the structure of the model, but it might be that it's because of the distribution in the data or some other thing about the data. And so typically you end up having to look at all of them, but sometimes it's easiest to identify there's an issue when you check at the products of the complete system, which is the output of the model. So.
And in addition to what Sarah said, more often than not, unless there is an easy way to change the inputs, one may have to be okay with some trade-offs. For example, if for certain underrepresented groups or whatever, the accuracy and the output is not good, one can apply constraint-based optimization and say, hey, for this subset, I am not okay with a false positive rate of more than X percentage, which means that you will accomplish that, but potentially at the cost of overall accuracy. And you might want to make that trade-off depending on how much the organization sort of specifically cares about these aspects, in addition to changing the inputs.
I would
Got
add
it.
to that, just
Yeah.
one thing I would add to that, it really depends on the problem and it would be very different. So for example, let's say you're building a system to recognize smiles and you find that women have a lot of false negatives, it's probably the case that you need more data. In some cases, you may need to have a particular fairness objective function. And so you might need to add some terms when you're building your model or some constraints. You may need to mask out certain sensitive variables. And so there you have to think about how do you do that in the model. You might have to look at different predicted scores depending on different groups of people, and that might, that's more around the output. So it means looking at the thresholds. It really depends on the specific problem, and the specific problem you have might have different manifestations in different parts of the pipeline. So just something to kind of think about as you build.
Got it. I think we have room for maybe one more question here. Sarah, I think you mentioned that it was difficult to scale up responsible AI in a large organization. So keen to hear from you if you've seen examples of concrete actions that have significantly contributed to the scaling up.
Yeah, I think probably the three things that I recommend is we really had our experts focus their energy on training and education that scales, as well as creating tools, right? Tools are a great way to help people get started in this. And then a lot of our energy has also been around forming communities, right? If you have a cohort of people who are all starting, they can support each other. They can say, I tried this in my team and that worked. This other team says we tried this other thing and that didn't work. And so it really has been about forming communities also to support each other.
Makes sense. So one last question here. As an ML practitioner who believes in responsible AI, where do you recommend a team should begin?
I mean, I'd say evaluation, and not just an aggregate, but also across specific subsets that are underrepresented or specific subsets of interest that oftentimes unearths new insights that inadvertently gets missed.
Awesome. Well, just want to say thank you again for joining us. We're at time. Thanks to our audience and very special thanks to our panelists here. I really appreciate you spending the time with us today. As I mentioned, we are Fiddler Labs. If you want to check us out, we're at fiddler.ai. And if you want to reach out to us, it's info@fiddler.ai. I hope everyone has a long and safe weekend. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.